So roughly a year ago, I had released a sound design project called Biota, where I created a generative ecosystem soundscape set in an alien rainforest. It's generative in the sense that each time you export it, you get new patterns and sounds. I didn't just synthesize alien sounds, I also created many familiar sounds like frogs and birds, and I figured I'd make a tutorial going through how I made Biota and how to start projects similar to this. I'll give a demo of what it sounds like, starting first with the day version. So that's the day version, now here's the night version. So that's the gist of it, but before I go into sound designing specific sounds, it's important to discuss some key topics that go into starting projects like this. The first topic is soundscape ecology. When you're beginning to synthesize natural sounds, it's important to understand what soundscapes are and what real-world soundscapes are made of. For those who've clicked on this video simply looking for tips on synthesizing animal sounds and whatnot, I've left timestamps in the description below. So think of a landscape. More importantly, think of what you often see in a landscape. For example, in nature, you might see distant mountains, clouds, trees, water, or even birds. But these are all just things that we can see and perceive visually. We also hear and smell things, for example. And so the acoustic version of this would be a soundscape. Think of what you might hear in a soundscape. Perhaps wind, rain, animal calls, insects, flowing water. All of these are constituents of a larger soundscape of combined sounds. Soundscape ecology is the field looking at sonic relationships between animals and their surrounding environments. You can compartmentalize these sounds into three primary categories. Sounds that living organisms produce, called Biophony. Non-biological sounds caused by natural forces like weather, called Geophony. And sounds and signals produced by humans, or our creations, called Anthrophony. And so, in the context of synthesizing natural soundscapes, we can use these categories to learn more about the acoustic relationships and components to create a more realistic soundscape. For the sake of this project, I'm only going to talk about the relationships of Biophony and Geophony, since there are no human sounds in my project. One of the most important steps towards synthesizing a real sound is analysis. To be specific, looking for patterns and movements in pitch, timing, and loudness help build an image of the building blocks required to make a sound. Analysis might also be important for observing the effects of sound degradation in different environments. For Biota, I had mostly looked at waveforms, frequency spectrums, and spectrograms to analyze various patterns in natural soundscapes. Waveforms provide an intuitive visual representation of amplitude and frequency. In my case, this meant using them to look at gaps in animal calls, loudness patterns, and some patterns in longer recordings. Frequency spectrums display the range of frequencies that make up a sound. They're useful for observing the harmonics and frequency ranges of many sounds. Since spectrograms detail both spectral and temporal characteristics of sounds, they are, in my opinion, the most useful for analyzing wildlife sounds. To give an example, here's a recording I took of a gray-tailed grackle song. As you can see, it's easy to observe the individual harmonics making up the sound, as well as the timing and gaps, fluctuations in pitch, and the intensity of the song as shown by the brightness. Spectrograms also make it easier to look for specific animal sounds in long-duration recordings. With these tools, you can compare real recordings with your synthesized versions to see where potential shortcomings of your sound design are, such as there possibly not being enough pitch modulation in certain sounds, causing them to seem inorganic, or maybe there are too many sounds happening at once. Remember though that it's important to simplify things, so try to break down sounds and soundscapes into their most simple components to better conceptualize a process of going about recreating them. I'll go into detail on my process for analyzing and synthesizing sounds once I start talking about sound design. But first, it's important to determine the amount of sounds in your ecosystem, in other words, the density. So in the beginning of the video, I mentioned how Biota is generative. But what does that really mean? It means that everything you hear is created by procedures I designed to generate evolving and ever-changing sounds. To show an example, I'll play an 8-second section of Biota twice. As you can see on these spectrograms, there are noticeable differences between the two clips I played, even though I had played the same section. This is because I synthesized every sound generatively. So I made Biota generative for a couple reasons. For one, you can avoid a lot of manual labor by only having to create a couple procedures for your species, rather than hundreds or even thousands of manual tweaks to create different variants of a sound. I also like the ability to export different versions of a soundscape if I happen to not like a particular version, and designing different procedures makes me think more about the species I'm creating rather than just the sound it's producing. The first procedures I want to go over are MIDI procedures, which include note chants, velocity deviation, and pitch randomization. I set up Biota so that each sound is triggered by recurring notes. Here's an example of one of the bird calls from Biota being triggered by notes with a 100% chance of playing. You can hear that even though the sound itself has procedural variations, it's repetitive and unrealistic. However, in Ableton Live 11 and 12, you can actually change the probability of a note triggering within the MIDI clip. Of course, there are many other ways to achieve this, but I'll specifically go over this method since it's the one I ended up using. At the bottom left of the MIDI clip, you can toggle on the expression editors. Click on the arrow to the right and select Chants. This opens up a new window allowing you to alter the chance of notes occurring. Here's that same bird call, but with less consistent intervals and a 50% chance of occurring. Not only does this sound a lot more authentic, but it has the benefit of giving unique results every time you play the clip over. The next MIDI procedure is velocity deviation. By randomizing the note velocities, you can effectively randomize the loudness of your sounds, or even map the velocity values to other parameters using the Max for Live device expression control. For randomizing velocity, you can use the velocity MIDI tool, but I prefer to create deviations within the MIDI, next to the note probabilities. You can do this by selecting your notes and playing with the deviation slider at the bottom. Here's a comparison of a regularly occurring electric keyboard with and without velocity deviation. The last MIDI procedure is pitch randomization. For this, I use the random MIDI device. The chance slider lets you control the chance of the pitch being randomized. Below is the choices knob, which determines how much will be added or subtracted from the original pitch randomly. You can also change whether you're adding, subtracting, or both using the sign switches. You can also change whether you're randomizing the pitch or cycling through the allowed outputs in a fixed order using the mode switches. Lastly, there's the interval knob, which multiplies the value of choices. Here's an example of the bird call from earlier with and without pitch randomization, though keep in mind that there are already subtle pitch variations within the patch itself. While all of these MIDI procedures help a lot with variation and realism, other important procedures are done through modulation, and so before I go into designing specific sounds, I'll go over a couple of those procedures too. Most sounds in Biota use modulators as a core part of their design. I'll briefly go over a few specific modulators I use for various purposes. It's important to note that I use phase plant to synthesize almost every sound in Biota. However, the majority of concepts I'll discuss are translatable across many synthesizers. I'll also clarify that I assume those watching have a general understanding of what modulation is and what some commonly used modulators are, as this video is geared more towards intermediate sound designers and above. With that being said, there are plenty of resources out there to easily learn about modulation. I primarily used LFOs and random modulators, as well as remap modulators for designing my sounds. Firstly, I'll discuss LFOs, or low-frequency oscillators. Earlier, I mentioned analyzing pitch fluctuations in various animal sounds. This is important for pitch modulation. When you're designing a specific animal sound, observing the fluctuations in pitch will paint a picture of what the LFO shape should look like. Analyzation also plays a role when doing volume modulation, as observing loudness patterns help guide shaping your LFOs to modulate the volume. For any modulation related to pitch or volume, I've often set my LFOs to trigger anytime a note starts to restart the modulation. To create more variety and fluctuations in your modulation, you can also use random modulation to make subtle timing variations in other LFOs. Random modulators also prove useful for many geophonic sounds, one example being random filter modulation for wind sounds. Remap modulators can provide more control over your modulation. Remap takes incoming values from other modulators and allows you to shape the output values. I mostly used remap for workflow reasons, often for complexifying simple LFO shapes to have separate control over the basic modulation and complicated modulation patterns. Remaps also give new ways to control probability, with one way being to only output values from a random modulator after a set threshold is reached. Now that I've gone over some of the procedures included in Biota, I'll explain specifically how I synthesized many of the natural sounds, starting with the geophonic sounds. One of the first sounds I designed and one of the simplest to make was wind. In short, wind is basically just noise with random filter modulation. I set up two groups, one for the low whooshing sound of the wind and one for the higher end rain sounds. I have the rain group along with the wind simply because they both include noise generators doing pretty much the same thing, just with different slope values. The first group consists of just a pink noise generator with a low pass filter, and the second group is just a noise generator with a changing slope value. As for modulation, I have two sine-shaped LFOs modulating the pan and gain of each group, with their rates being modulated by a random LFO. At the end of the modulator chain, there's another random smooth LFO modulating the rain generator's slope value, which goes between pink and brown noise. In the effects lanes, I'm essentially just filtering each group separately. Here's what the signal chain looks like for the processing. The first component in the chain is an EQ with two bell curves, with each of them having their frequency and gain amounts modulated by two sine LFOs. Following that, I have an EQ with a fairly resonant peak at around 120 Hz and a high-pass filter with its frequency being barely modulated by the random LFOs as well. I have a couple other effects which, aside from a simple reverb, are just multiband compressors taming and controlling the wind. Next, I'll discuss my process for synthesizing thunder. I went for a more distant and degraded thunder sound to avoid very complex synthesis, as I mainly wanted the complexity to lie within the Biophony. In my patch, I have a noise generator with a 1.8 decibel per octave slope value and a low-pass filter. The cutoff of the filter is being modulated by the velocity of the incoming notes. This is for a subtle effect of louder strikes feeling closer. The volume of the group is being modulated by a normal LFO and a random LFO. The normal LFO, which has its rate slightly modulated by another random LFO, modulates the gain, giving the general shape of the sound. And the random LFO creates imperfections and chaos on top of that general shape. In the lanes, I have a simple filter alongside a transient shaper, which has its attack and pump values being randomly modulated to emphasize more random transients in the sound. The signal chain consists of a simple EQ with a low pass and a high pass, followed by a chain of LFOs modulating a device that emulates distance. I'll go over this in detail when I talk about sound degradation. Following that is another chain with both a convolution and an algorithmic reverb, which I'll also discuss in more detail later. The last geophonic sound I'll go over is rain. This is pretty much the only sound in Biota that isn't entirely synthesized from scratch, as doing generative sound design for realistic droplets is very complex, but an interesting endeavor nonetheless that I want to explore in the future, though it was beyond the focus of Biota. In the patch, there are two generator groups, with the first one being the sound of droplets hitting the forest floor and the second group being the more atmospheric noisy rain. The droplets were done through granular synthesis. For those who aren't familiar, granular synthesis is a method of synthesis wherein a sound is split into many smaller pieces, called grains. You can change many parameters of these grains, such as their duration, volume, phases, and more. In my case, I used the recording I took of outdoor rain and split it into 3 simultaneous grains in a given instance with a length of roughly 1 second each. This results in a more cloudy sound that will generate for as long as I need it to. The noisier rain is just a noise generator with the slope being randomly modulated between values of pink and white noise, which is slightly higher in frequency content than the rain noise in the wind patch, which was modulated between pink and brown noise, but gives another layer to the rain ambience. These geophonic sounds are important for contextualizing the biophonic sounds in the soundscape, and really are soundscapes of their own as they paint an auditory picture of the surrounding environment. Next, I'll discuss some of the ways I designed the biophonic sounds. Earlier, I had mentioned the importance of acoustic relationships in soundscapes. This is especially important when considering the effect geophony might have on biophonic sounds. One example is thinking about how animals might react to rain or thunder sounds, or perhaps imagining the biophonic density gradients between dry regions and wet regions of an environment. Just to quickly clarify, I'll be saving an overview of any post-processing for the biophonic sounds for when I discuss emulating environmental acoustics. When it comes to synthesizing animal sounds, bird calls can be some of the easiest sounds to recreate depending on the type of call. You can produce really convincing bird calls just by pitch modulating sine waves based on the pitch patterns of real calls. I'll briefly go over a couple calls that I designed. The first call simulates a general songbird kind of sound and starts with a 3 kHz sine wave. I'm controlling the volume shape of the call with an LFO. The LFO's output value is also being input into a remap modulator, which is mapped to the pitch of the sine wave. This creates ascending and descending variations in pitch as the call occurs. And for subtle temporal variations, I have a random LFO modulating the initial LFO's rate. The second call is some sort of alien toucan sound, starting with 6 sine waves to match similarly with the harmonics of an actual toucan call. I'm using an LFO as a more precise envelope for the sound, along with a similar LFO modulating a frequency shifter. Lastly, I'm rapidly modulating the volume with another LFO. Bird sounds are incredibly diverse, and you could spend literally an eternity synthesizing new ones. The ones I designed are fairly simple, but learning new ways to create various bird calls and songs may actually help with a variety of sound design skills. Crickets are another easily synthesizable sound. Ring modulation was my main method of synthesizing crickets, an idea I got from a great article by Cosine Sound on cricket synthesis, linked below. However, my method does differ a little bit. I began with two sine oscillators, one creating a constant hum at 4.4 kHz, resembling something like a house cricket, and the other serving as the fundamental for a rhythmic chirping at 6.6 kHz. Each of these sines are routed into ring modulators. However, just using a sine oscillator for the ring mod will result in only two partials, which does not accurately replicate the richer harmonics of a real cricket sound. Different ring modulators may offer different modulation waveforms, and sticking to something akin to that of a triangle wave may produce more accurate results. In my case, I rectified the sine oscillators a little bit, which modulates the carrier sine with a lot more harmonics, producing more partials. In the modulator lane, I have an LFO, which mildly modulates the frequency value of the first ring modulator, along with the gain of the first sine oscillator, just to create subtle imperfections so the hum is a little less annoying. The next LFO modulates the gain of the second sine in a rhythmic manner, creating gaps between chirps. At the end of the lane, there's a random LFO creating more imperfections in the sound. Lastly, I'm shifting the overall frequency output by an arbitrary amount using a frequency shifter with a mix value set to halfway, basically creating a duplicate of the sound in a lower frequency range, just to make it sound a little more unique. There are plenty of other ways to synthesize cricket sounds, some of which are included in the article I mentioned earlier. For the night version of Biota, I synthesized some deep frog-like croaking. These sounds are a simplified version of real frog calls. The reference croaks I used showed two dominant frequency ranges with an increase in pitch over the duration of the call as well as a roughly 30 millisecond gap between each syllable. In my version, I set up two waveforms. The first is a semi-angular sine, which in hindsight doesn't really create any harmonic interest. You would get more noticeable results using a saw or square. The second oscillator is a higher pitched sine wave. I imitated the trill by modulating the volume with an LFO using a ramp slope. My trill's rate is a little slower than the reference sound, as there are roughly 40 millisecond gaps between each syllable, although the rate is being lightly modulated by another LFO. For the pitching up of the croak, I simply modulated a frequency shifter using a subtle ramp slope. Lastly, I'm adding artificial stereo via distortion spread. Since this sound is pretty simple, a neat way to make the sound a little more interesting is to route each oscillator to parallel effects lanes, insert ring modulators, and play with the frequency amounts to get weird and guttural results. Not every sound in Biota resembles something real. I actually started Biota on a call with an artist friend of mine, where I would create sounds based on alien creatures he drew. I'll link his work below. But eventually, this process formed into the ecosystem soundscape it is now, but here are some of the original concept arts and sounds. The swallow is what I believe to be the first creature we came up with. Basically, it's just a frog-looking guy that dwells in bushes and captures insects. Phototaxis, the movement of an organism in reaction to light, seems to be ubiquitous in life on Earth. I thought it'd be interesting if more creatures in my world exhibited phonotaxis, movement in reaction to sound, since the planet is darker. In this way, creatures like the swallow could lure other organisms through sound. There's nothing too fascinating going on in the sound design. I'm essentially just performing FM and subtractive synthesis on a sine wave, and emphasizing the ram's horn vowel with a formant filter. The next creature is the Delo. The idea is that this creature also lures in mostly flying organisms, this time using light emitted from underneath its shell, stinging them with its tentacles. I imagine it mostly sitting in one place while it makes a low humming sound. Again, there's not too much going on here, just pitch modulation on some sine waves with a little extra harmonics. The clicker is some amphibian creature we came up with that just makes clicking sounds to communicate with other clickers. The clicking sound patch is just basic pitch modulation, but it actually gets its main qualities in post. I pushed the sound heavily with distortion, creating audible aliased frequencies that I isolated with an EQ for interesting lower frequency characteristics. I then cleaned up the sound with transient isolation and compression, followed by a formant filter being modulated to bring out random vowels in the sound. The floa is one of my favorite designs. It's a floating plant that drops seeds as it floats around, making high-pitched sounds as it vibrates to disperse them. The sound consists of pitch modulation for the vibration speed, ring modulation for a little more harmonic character, frequency dispersion, and transient shaping. The lort is a bug-like creature that generates electricity in its rostrum, which it uses to zap various ground-dwelling organisms. The sound is produced via a sawtooth wave that has its amplitude and pitch being modulated, which is being run through a series of transient shapers, EQs, and a frequency disperser. The owl is a bird creature that attracts mates by tilting its head up and creating a call with a glowing sound organ. The sound is just a simple sine wave, with its amplitude being modulated by an LFO that also plugs into a remap, which modulates the pitch, creating rapid fluctuations on top of the general LFO shape. The last alien I'll show is the crescent, which is another bug-like creature. It creates sound by vibrating plates on its back whilst making sound with its mouth to communicate with other crescents. The patch for this just has a sine oscillator and another with a more complex and vocal waveform. As for modulation, it's just more AM and FM synthesis. Again, credit to my friend Sam for illustrating these creatures. While the Biophony and Geophony might sound nice when anechoic, simulating the degradation and propagation of these sounds are crucial in creating a realistic soundscape. Sounds behave in interesting and unique ways as they travel through an environment. When designing a sonic ecosystem, it's necessary to consider the acoustic properties of whatever environment the sounds travel through. There are plenty of ways to digitally create acoustic behaviors. The conditions and layout of an environment shape sounds and how they traverse. Thinking about the composition of your environment will give you an idea of what tools to use. For example, simulating the acoustics of an urban environment might involve more focus on reflection rather than absorption, since you're dealing with harder materials and more angular structures. So using more delays to create echo instead of just reverb could help, along with filtering sounds as though they're being attenuated by physical barriers. If your environment is something more like a forest, you may want to consider things like how porous the ground is and how much vegetation absorbs the sound, so heavier filtering and dense reverberation might work. There are innumerable factors that go into the effects on sound as it travels. So, doing research on how sound attenuates due to propagation and barriers, known as geometrical divergence, and how it is reflected and/or absorbed, along with how quickly it travels based on the conditions of your environment, are crucial. Generally, the further away a sound is, the larger the spread. This of course means that it gets quieter over greater distance, starting with the higher frequencies. For creative purposes, I tend to think of it as the environment taking over the sound. This is to say that the further a sound is, the more you understand about the environment rather than the original sound itself. In Biota, sounds further away start with less stereo width, as the sound source is less encompassing, and so I then add stereo width with the simulated effects of propagation such as reverberation and delay. I also used filters to emulate high-frequency damping as the sound gets further. You could do this all separately, of course, but I used the handy Max for Live device called ml.distance, which combines these effects into one device. I'll leave it linked below. Another important aspect of creating a convincing environment is the stereo placement of sounds. If all sounds occupy the same place in the stereo field, it won't sound like a surrounding 3D environment. It's crucial to convey depth in all your sounds. All of the sounds in Biota have different pan amounts, with many of their pan values being modulated and changing slowly over time. There's a version of ML distance that actually simulates the Doppler effect as well, which might be useful for those looking to simulate faster movement. Personally, I didn't care to simulate the Doppler effect as the creatures in Biota don't move very much, so the effect wouldn't really be too noticeable. You can portray communication between organisms by placing two or more of the same calls in different stereo positions. I mainly created depth by making a duplicate group of all the generative Biophony with slightly different parameters, and drowning it in reverberation and other effects to make them sound distant. This, on top of the less degraded sounds, gives a sense of scale. In terms of reverberation, I heavily used convolution reverb to convey the reflections of the environment. Put simply, convolution reverb processes a sound using a recording of a physical or digital acoustic space, called an impulse response. In physical space, the impulse response is usually a recording of a transient noisy sound, such as a clap, called the impulse, and the reflections of the environment following in response to that impulse, called the response. I used a free forest impulse response from the Open Air library, a library full of free impulse responses. You can find it linked in the description. The further away I deem a sound to be, the more convolution reverb I mix into the sound. I also used algorithmic reverbs on top of the convolution reverb, just to add onto and control the reflections a little bit more. And so there you have it. Those are all of the main steps included in the making of Biota. However, it's important to note that it's not just the processes alone that are important. It's just as much about your creativity and intuition for creating and depicting sounds. Research is very important for projects like this, but honestly, you'll achieve a lot by just listening to environments and using your knowledge and intuitions to mimic them. Try not to stress too much on the technical aspects in creating a soundscape like this. It really is more important to be creative and follow your intuition. I made this video largely because there are a lot more creative people out there, and with the right resources and knowledge, you can create some genuinely amazing and intricate soundscapes. I hope this video is as resourceful and inspiring as I intended it to be. If you want to support Biota, you can buy it on my Bandcamp page, linked below. Lastly, if you have any critiques or any information you want to add on to this video, feel free to let me know in the comments. Thank you.